Good evening, you're watching World News Tonight on TVP World. I'm Aaron Darman. Coming up, a blunt message from NATO's Secretary-General in Warsaw as he tells Russia and Vladimir Putin to expect a devastating response if they attack an ally country. More on that in just a moment, but first, tonight's headlines. The EU says unconditional withdrawal of Russia from Ukraine is a precondition to amend sanctions as Volodymyr Zelensky arrives in Paris for peace talks. Moscow lays out demands before Black Sea ceasefire can begin. And the EU warns its citizens to stockpile essentials for up to 72 hours. NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte says the military alliance would respond with full force in the event of an attack on Poland or any ally country. It comes as Europe faces uncertainty over America's commitments to the Security Pact. Rutte touched down in Warsaw today to meet with Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk and President Andrzej Duda. Sonia Agata-Biszczan reports.
In his meeting with the Polish Prime Minister, NATO Secretary-General made it clear that in the event of an attack on Poland, the alliance would step in.
If anyone were to miscalculate and think they can get away with an attack on Poland or on any other ally, they will be met with the full force of this fierce alliance. Our reaction will be devastating.
He made it very clear that the commitment is rock solid, and he sent very strong message to Putin.
NATO is operating under the principle that an attack against one ally is considered an attack against them all, vested in Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. Recognizing Russia as a real threat not only to Ukraine but also to Europe, Donald Tusk emphasized the importance of ensuring Poland's security.
Who more than Poland deserves full support and full guarantees from NATO? We can't change our geographical position, we can't change our history, but we are determined like no other NATO country. When it comes to defense spending, we really spend a lot on defense.
Mark Rutte applauded Poland for its defense expenditure, which at 4.7% of GDP for 2025 is the highest among NATO members.
He's tried to convince the rest of Europe to spend more, and Poland plays an example in his rhetoric to Americans that, look, Europe is stepping up.
The NATO Secretary-General later met with Polish President Andrzej Duda and delivered a lecture titled Stronger NATO, Commitment to Euro-Atlantic Security.
It's great to be back in Warsaw,
which focused on Ukraine and the surrounding peace talks. Speaking to the media, Rutte shared his vision of a lasting peace with TVP World.
when you have a full ceasefire / a peace deal, what the Americans are now doing step by step is trying to get there. I commend their efforts. But obviously what we need to make sure of is that when this war ends one day, that Putin will not try this again.
This is Rutte's second visit to Poland since he took on the role as NATO Secretary General last October. From Warsaw, for TVP World, Sonia Agata-Biszczan.
Paris will again turn into the city of diplomacy tomorrow as leaders gather in the French capital for a summit on the war in Ukraine. And as we go to air tonight, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and his French counterpart Emmanuel Macron are meeting at the Élysée Palace for a working dinner. Kazimierz Szwyszek has more.
The guest of honor has arrived in Paris. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was greeted on Wednesday by French President Emmanuel Macron.
These last few weeks, we've intensively spoken with President Zelensky, US President Trump, and a number of our colleagues that we will see tomorrow on the topic of a sustainable peace in Ukraine that guarantees our continent's stability.
On Thursday, the two heads of state will be joined by 30 other leaders, including Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, for a special summit on Ukraine. This one will be aimed at finalizing the shape of the Coalition of the Willing, a group of Ukraine's allies willing to put troops on the ground as a security guarantee.
It comes from the idea that I think many of the countries understand that the current European support is insufficient to Ukraine. So Europe should do more, but Europe cannot do more because of the two diverse approaches to the war.
US President Donald Trump, whether Europe likes it or not, has no intention of sending American soldiers to Ukraine with the gargantuan task of keeping peace. So far, only France and the UK have expressed readiness to commit their troops in the future, leaving experts skeptical about its implementation.
No, it's not possible. We don't have the conditions for that, so I think we are probably moving in the wrong direction with this. We don't have yet the enough capacity for Europeans to actually organize that. And second, Moscow will not agree to this.
The summit in Paris comes only 2 days after the US, Russia and Ukraine came to an agreement on another partial ceasefire, a naval truce following the energy one. The deal immediately raised doubts over its conditions, which seem beneficial mostly to Russia itself.
There's already a ceasefire on the Black Sea because the Russians can't use the Black Sea because the Ukrainians have sunk 40% of the Russian Black Sea fleet. So this is something that's good for Vladimir Putin. It's not necessarily good for Ukraine.
Speaking for a US media outlet on Wednesday, President Trump was forced to address the growing concerns voiced by Western officials and analysts alike that Russia could be simply playing for time.
I think that Russia wants to see an end to it, but it could be that they're dragging their feet. I've done it over the years.
The Paris summit is now an opportunity for European leaders to once again reaffirm their full support for Ukraine. While many countries, including Poland, are against committing peacekeeping troops without the Americans on board, Europe is still proving itself to be Kyiv's most reliable partner in recent weeks. For TVP World, I'm Kazimierz Łyszak.
And staying with Ukraine now, we go to our correspondent Oz Chatterjee in Kyiv. Good evening, Oz. We've heard about this potential ceasefire deal in the Black Sea. It's brokered by the US. The Kremlin says it has its demands. What can you tell us?
Well, look, from the perspective of what's happening in Ukraine, nothing has changed. Just as we are coming to air, there's been an air raid alert across Kyiv right now, just happened as we were coming to air. So this is the reality that the Ukrainians are dealing with. And when it comes to this supposed Black Sea ceasefire deal, as the previous package had just said, the Ukrainians effectively have a Black Sea deal of their own that they enforced through the use of sinking Black Sea fleet vessels that owned by Russia, stationed in occupied Sevastopol. So TVP World spoke to an analyst to get his opinion on the ceasefire deal. Let's take a listen to what Michael McKay had to say about this.
I think it's a mistake to call this a peace deal or even a ceasefire, because that's not what's happening here. What we see is a presentation of Russian demands through the voice of the United States, and this is extremely unfortunate. The reason I don't see it as a ceasefire is the Battle of the Black Sea has effectively been won by Ukraine. The armed forces of Ukraine have defeated the Black Sea fleet.
Now, it's important to note that while we're talking about this Black Sea proposed ceasefire, Russia hasn't agreed to it yet. It still has a list of demands, including being allowed to transact with banks that the Europeans would have to agree to. So far, the Europeans are saying no. So this whole idea of a Black Sea ceasefire deal may never see the light of day, even if we were to take it at face value and assume that it means something for the Ukrainians as it is now. Now, the ceasefire that's supposed to be in place is the energy ceasefire brokered by the US, which the Kremlin said came into effect on March 18th, when Putin and Donald Trump had that phone conversation. The Ukrainians today are reporting that 8 times Russia has violated that since March 18th. That's coming from Dmitry Litvin, presidential advisor. President Zelensky posted a statement on his Telegram this morning about the continued Russian strikes on Ukrainian territory. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
Last night, 117 attack drones, most of them Shaheeds, were in our skies. This was more proof of Russia's prolongation of this war. Most of the drones were shot down by our defenders. Dnipro, Sumy, Cherkasy and other regions were under Russian attack. There was a large-scale drone strike on Kryvyi Rih, on the local business and on civilian infrastructure. In Ochtyrka, houses, shops and ordinary infrastructure were damaged. Communities in Donetsk, Kharkiv and Zaporizhia regions also came under fire. All those affected must be provided with assistance. But we need strong steps from the world and obvious pressure on Russia, more pressure, more sanctions from the United States to stop the Russian strikes. To carry out such large-scale strikes after ceasefire negotiations is to show everyone in the world that Moscow is not going to make real peace. Since March 11th, there has been an American proposal for a complete cessation of strikes, and literally every night, with its strikes, Russia responds with no to the peace proposal of its partners.
It's clear there how the Ukrainian president feels about the situation. Now, that was a statement posted this morning as we're coming to where air raid sirens are happening across Kyiv again. So looks like another night of Russian bombardment of Ukraine. Nothing has changed on the ground, despite the words coming out of Washington and the Kremlin about this supposed ceasefire deal. Back to you in the studio, Aaron.
Thank you, Oz Chatterjee, our Ukraine correspondent in Kyiv, and stay safe. A Russian court has handed down long prison sentences to members of Ukraine's Azov regiment, which led the defence of the city of Mariupol in the early months of the war. Media reports suggest 12 Ukrainians will spend between 13 to 23 years in high-security colonies, while another 11 were sentenced in absentia as they've already returned to Ukraine through a prisoner exchange. The defendants were charged with terrorist activity and violently seizing or retaining power. Ukrainian authorities have condemned the trial as a political show, saying it violated international law. The accused themselves say they were tortured and forced to sign false testimonies. All European citizens should stockpile enough food, water and essentials to last 72 hours in case of emergency, with war the worst case scenario. These are just some of the recommendations issued by the EU as it calls for member states to prepare for any potential future crisis. Our EU correspondent Angela Skujins reports from Brussels.
5 years since the onset of the COVID pandemic, Europe is facing a barrage of new threats. This is exactly why the European Commission on Wednesday handed down its EU Preparedness Union strategy. This is a 17-page document aimed at better ensuring the bloc's member states as well as citizens are prepared for whatever scenario comes their way. This spans natural to man-made disasters such as floods and cyber attacks. Now, let's take a listen to what the European Commissioner for Crisis Preparedness, Haji Labib, said regarding these threats.
For 3 years in Ukraine, we have seen a battlefield of bombs and bullets, drones, fighter planes, trenches and submarines. Yes, our European security is directly threatened by this. It is also threatened by other battlefields. The battlefields in our pockets, our phones, our computers, our power plants, our banks, our supply chains, our raw materials, and in the media, the social media we consumed every day. These are all battlefields, and they are being weaponized to threaten our European way of life and our democracies.
TVP World asked the Commissioner what real-life examples had informed the making of this document. However, she could not reveal any of them, citing confidentiality issues. But what we know from a senior EU official is that these threats are becoming more out of the box and aggressive. This spans attacks on critical infrastructure as well as arson on aeroplanes. This reminded us of the Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk announcing in January that he had become aware of Russian plotted terrorist attacks on aeroplanes. This was confirmed by US intelligence services, saying that they had foiled these attacks attacks after notifying the Kremlin of their knowledge. However, we also know that the Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk met with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte today in Warsaw. Let's take a listen to what that Warsaw official had to say regarding specific attacks in the Baltics regarding cable cuts.
We also talked about direct actions. We were both involved in the Baltic Sentry, which was our response. And I want to thank you for your quick response when we needed NATO in the Baltic after the very dangerous incident caused by strange ships. Strange, but always with the same type of crew. I'm referring to the attacks on undersea roads and communication lines, and to the fact that Poland, together with other Baltic states, and with your and NATO's support, reacted quickly. This greatly increased our sense of security, which is very important to us for various reasons, including our infrastructure here in the Baltic Sea.
The strategy also calls on the European Commission as well as the EU High Representative Kaja Kallas to publish a threat and risk assessment by the end of 2026. But many here in the Belgian capital are wondering if we have the luxury of time to wait that long. This is why the document also recommends that citizens become active in their own preparedness. Now, nationals are recommended to stockpile enough food, water and other supplies to weather a 72-hour event. So we'll wait and see what comes out of that threat assessments and how those member states move on those recommendations. Angela Skujins from Brussels for TVP World.
Protesters have taken to the streets in Romania to rail against the banning of far-right presidential candidate Călin Georgescu. The country is set to go to the polls again in May after the first round of votes were annulled following allegations that Georgescu benefited from Russian interference. But as Konrad Gorlinski explains, the momentum for Georgescu and his movement could be fading.
It's an unusual way to celebrate a birthday, but on the occasion of banned far-right presidential candidate Călin Georgescu's birthday, AUD party members and supporters organized a rally in Bucharest Constitution Square Wednesday to protest the government's decision to bar him from running in the upcoming May elections. Now, the turnout was great for a birthday, but not so much for a political rally.
The interest for Mr. Georgescu is fading because there are no more than 3,000 people in Bucharest which are rallying.
Romania is due to repeat its presidential election in May after the country's top court voided the original vote in December amid accusations of Russian meddling in favor of Georgescu, who had been leading in the polls. Now, so far, Russian collusion can't be proved, but financial improprieties are clear.
So for somebody who declared zero spending, a lot of millions were found around him.
The decision of Romania's constitutional court to annul the election results were nevertheless met with much controversy, and news of it traveled all the way across the Atlantic.
You don't have shared values if you cancel elections because you don't like the result, and that happened in Romania.
In Romania, Georgescu's case is not unique. So far, 11 out of 22 candidates for the upcoming elections have been rejected by the Romanian Electoral Authority, including far-right European Parliament member Diana Șoșoacă. However, a recent poll showed that Donald Trump-style right-wing candidates still enjoy quite a lot of support.
So they are not alike, but in total, we can count 1/3 of the voters which are close to these ideas and close to the Trumpist idea in Romania and all around the world.
Andrei Taranu sees this support fading once the campaign officially takes off in April, particularly as Romanians were expecting to get visa-free travel to the U.S. next month. But Homeland Security put that under review on Tuesday.
For sure, a lot of Romanians felt treated by the Trump administration in the United States. They are now looking a little bit suspicious on what has happened because Usually, they presume that the United States it is their first and the most important ally. Now, Romania became a sort of an island. A lot of them, they are looking to going back into the shield of the European Union.
Poland's Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski may be visiting Bucharest Thursday to do just that.
We return now to our top story. NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte has delivered a fierce warning to Russia to stay away or risk facing the full brunt of the alliance. It comes in the same week that the United States announced a maritime security deal in the Black Sea with Russia and Ukraine. The Kremlin maintains that agreement will only come into force if sanctions on Russia's banks and exports are lifted. Joining me now in the studio to break it all down is Kerry Longhurst, Professor at Collegium Civitas. Good evening.
Hello, good evening.
Can I start with some developments from the last few hours? The EU says that, quote, unconditional withdrawal of Russia from Ukraine is a precondition to amend sanctions. What do you make of that, and will Russia ever agree to it?
Well, it's the right thing to say. It's correct for the conditions, but absolutely not. I don't think Putin has any intention of abiding by that kind of rule. It's not just about land that he wants. It's all about liquidating the sovereignty of Ukraine and vanquishing Ukrainian identity. So no, there's no indication at all that he'd abide by this kind of order or request.
And we've gone back and forth on peace negotiations. There's some talk of the US wanting a broad ceasefire by April 20. Do you believe it's possible to achieve such a quick ceasefire without giving away Ukrainian land or making concessions that ultimately fly in the face of Ukrainian sovereignty?
Yeah, I hate to be pessimistic, but I really don't see it happening. I think what we've heard coming out of Saudi Arabia this past few days or so is very little in terms of concrete detail and very little that could really kind of bridge European perspectives or American perspectives and Russia, never mind Ukrainian perspectives as well. So I don't think we have many reasons to be optimistic about the end of April being a date for a broad ceasefire. So there's too much distance between the main stakeholders, and I think crucially the main stakeholder, i.e. Ukraine, isn't going to be served the kind of deal, the kind of settlement it absolutely deserves.
Is that a worry, that maybe there will be a ceasefire by April 20, but it won't be a just ceasefire for Ukraine?
Yeah, I think the notion of a just ceasefire is a long way off, and I don't think anyone apart from the Europeans even have the appetite or the belief in that. I mean, if you hear what's coming out of the kind of discourse from the United States, apart from there being gross incompetence all around, there doesn't seem to be a recognition that Ukraine needs to be compensated or that Russia should be punished for its aggression. So there isn't a meeting of minds or an overlap at all with regards to what a ceasefire could look like within a month or so.
Mark Rutte today, he told us, and I quote, if anyone were to make a mistake and think they could get away with an attack on Poland or any other ally, they would face the full force of this fierce alliance. Is this a threat to Moscow, or is it a message to reassure allies that NATO will keep them safe?
Yeah, I mean, there were strong words, and it's quite correct that he chose to use those words and that tenor here in Poland. I mean, Poland has been probably the best NATO citizen for a long time now, and it's no surprise that Trump is lauding praise towards Poland almost non-stop. But of course, those words were the kind of repetition of Article 5, and of course primarily they were against Putin and his acolytes around the world, but they were indeed about reassuring and kind of showing solidarity in amongst NATO allies and citizens as well, and populations. But I think as well his words were also intended for American ears and the White House in particular to say, look, don't forget, NATO is about all of us, and that we shouldn't race towards, dividing NATO between a European voice and an American voice. So I think they were words for all of those stakeholders and all of those actors involved.
And for Mark Rutte, I mean, as the head of NATO, it will be crucial to keep the US on side, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it seems like his relationship, let's say, with Donald Trump is better than it could be, but it's worse than it should be, I would say. So, of course, he's pivotal in this. But I think what is worrying, or what has kind of emerged really, are these two different voices and pillars of NATO, which, as the head of NATO, he has to try to overcome and strive and sandwich back together.
You mentioned the significance of Mr. Rutte making these comments here in Poland? What does it say about NATO's relationship with Poland and Poland's role in NATO?
Well, I think it shows that the alliance realises as a whole, and bear in mind that NATO is a huge organisation, that this Eastern Front, this frontier of NATO really is the most important to protect and defend. So I think it says that. But it is, as I mentioned before, in recognition that Poland has emerged as perhaps the best or one of the best NATO citizens since it joined NATO all those years ago. And this is why it's happened here in Warsaw, and Warsaw is the focal point for the alliance's position towards NATO and this whole eastern frontier as a whole, from the very north to the very south.
Black Sea, when it comes to security in the region, we look at the Black Sea and this ceasefire deal is shaping up, but it's only if the Kremlin gets what it wants. Is this a step in the right or the wrong direction for Ukraine?
Definitely in the wrong direction, not just for Ukraine, but I think for the Western world and democracy in general. From what I understand, the terms of that, they're calling it a partial ceasefire, isn't really worth a great deal to us and to Ukraine and the West, but it is worth a great deal to Russia. It would mean rehabilitating Russia into the global trading world order, which is not surely in our interests or in the interest of Ukraine. So we shouldn't really call it a positive deal for our side at all, I would say.
Is there an argument to be made that there has to be some sort of outreach to Vladimir Putin? You have to give him something for him to even come to the table?
Well, I suppose I'm sitting here in Warsaw and I'm quite comfortable, and I'd like to say no, we shouldn't give any concessions at all. I mean, it's a terrorist state. It was unprovoked aggression into a sovereign country. So, you know, why should we entertain this idea of a concession? And that's a pretty big concession, allowing this trade route to continue. I think Putin is also talking about reducing sanctions and allowing banking to return. So that would be a huge range of sanctions for a country which carried out punitive measures towards a sovereign country.
When we talk about concessions, a really interesting dynamic going on between obviously Vladimir Putin, Russia, and the Donald Trump administration. Is there a point where Vladimir Putin does wave the white flag, or will he just drag his heels more and more to get as much as he can out of Donald Trump?
Yeah, I really don't like agreeing on any kind of front with Donald Trump, but I think on this idea he's completely correct. And I think it shows either that Trump isn't a very good, calculator or business person, because he didn't read this deal very well at all. And it seems like only now he's realising perhaps that Putin does not want peace, does not want a full cessation of hostilities. But I think more fundamentally, Putin does not have the vocabulary of peace. It's not what he wants. He isn't just interested in a land grab into Ukraine. Like I said before, he wants to diminish or liquidate Ukraine's sovereignty.
Volodymyr Zelensky and French President Emmanuel Macron in Paris tonight. President Macron will host another leaders' summit tomorrow. We've seen these Paris summits before. I was there a couple of weeks ago. Will this be hot air, or do you expect some sort of progress?
I think there'll always be a fair amount of hot air when it comes to Europeans meeting together. It's bringing together a very, very large number of countries. I expect as well there's a bit of competition for leading that group between Britain and France and maybe others as well. So the hot air is inevitable. But things have moved on so quickly. This terrible partial ceasefire is on the brink. Incompetence from the United States. So I think hopefully this is a chance where the Europeans really will commit to something tangible. They'll back this idea with concrete measures to bring boots onto the ground. They'll talk in detailed form about security guarantees. I'm optimistic, but I've been optimistic or overly optimistic before. But I'm still hopeful that it'll be more than hot air tomorrow.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, I hope so.
Kerry Longhurst, Professor at Collegium Civitas, thank you again for your time.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And that's all for World News tonight here on TVP World. Do stay with us. I'm Aaron Darman. Good night.